This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. For most of its recent history, Saudi Arabia has been a petro-state, with the vast majority of its economic activity related to its booming oil industry, and a disproportionate amount of this being dictated by the public sector. However, anticipating the green transition and a reduced global demand for oil, in 2016, Mohammed bin Salman announced a new plan to transform the Saudi economy into a diversified private sector economy, known as Vision 2030. So in today's video, we're going to be explaining what Vision 2030 actually involves, what problems it purports to solve, and perhaps most importantly, whether it can actually work. Now, before we start talking about profits from oil or the decision-making of the Saudi government, it's worth noting that Saudi Arabia has a pretty horrendous human rights record, and that there's obviously an environmental cost to profiting from oil. Now, we're not going to go deep into that in this video, but it is worth caveating all the positive talk surrounding Saudi's economy with the fact that a lot of this growth comes on the back of human rights abuses and environmental damage. So, in order to understand Vision 2030, you're going to first need to know a bit about Saudi Arabia's economy. As we mentioned at the top, Saudi Arabia is essentially a petro-state, and that's because according to the IMF's latest data, oil accounts for about 85% of all exports, and the oil industry as a whole directly accounts for over 40% of GDP. And while that might sound like a lot, if anything, those numbers understate the country's reliance on oil, because much of their non-oil GDP is in some way oil-related too, i.e. involving plastics or other oil derivatives, or it depends on government subsidies, which are in turn funded by oil revenue. Now, this isn't intrinsically a bad thing. Saudi Arabia is both the world's largest oil producer, producing between 10 and 12% of the world's oil each day, and the world's only so-called swing producer, which means it's the only country capable of rapidly ramping up production in order to meet global demand. Therefore, its unique position in the global oil markets has afforded Saudi Arabia some immense political power, as demonstrated by Biden's recent visit to Riyadh. And it's also brought millions of ordinary Saudis out of poverty. In fact, it's hard to overstate how much the lives of ordinary Saudis have been improved since the discovery of oil. Even by 1950, life expectancy was only 39 years, the majority of the population suffered from trachoma, and safe drinking water was difficult to come by in a country without a single river. Ultimately, it was this oil revenue that brought clean drinking water, electricity, and energy to an otherwise barren desert state. And GDP per capita has risen by an astonishing 3,500% since World Bank records began in 1968. Nonetheless, being dependent on oil reserves has its downsides. For starters, being dependent on any single export often crowds out other industries. This is known as the Dutch disease, named after the Netherlands' economic woes following the discovery of natural gas in the 60s. Basically, when you've got one main export, demand pushes up the value of your currency, which makes your other exports uncompetitive. A similar thing has clearly happened in Saudi Arabia too, given that oil and oil derivatives now account for more than 90% of all exports by value. And to be honest, being dependent on oil isn't a particularly great long-term strategy, given both that the green transition should in theory reduce global oil demand, and that domestic consumption, which is heavily subsidized, is constantly rising and now accounts for a record 20% of all of the country's production. It's also made the Saudi economy particularly reliant on the public sector because, well, the Saudi oil company, Saudi Aramco, is majority state-owned. In fact, of roughly 4 million working Saudis, only 600,000 are employed in the non-oil private sector. The rest are civil servants. On top of that, foreign workers, who are usually cheaper than local Saudis with less employment rights, account for 90% of non-oil private sector jobs. And finally, being dependent on oil revenues leaves you vulnerable to the whims of the global oil market. Consider the fact that in the 4 years between 2007 and 2011, oil prices doubled, halved, and doubled again. Obviously, this sort of volatility makes economic planning almost impossible. And after the oil crash in 2014, the Saudi government was forced to make a whole load of politically painful budget cuts, including steep reductions in gasoline, energy, and water subsidies. Now, Vision 2030, launched by Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in 2016, aims to solve all of these problems. Firstly, it wants to diversify the Saudi economy, with a particular focus on mining and tourism. Saudi Arabia holds 7% of the world's phosphate reserves, as well as significant deposits of bauxite, gold, copper, and zinc. And that's important, because many of these commodities will see increased demand during the green transition, at the exact same time that oil demand is expected to fall. But as things stand, mining accounts for barely a fraction of economic activity. In 2015, for example, mining contributed only 4% of the Saudi GDP. But Vision 2030 wants to double that number and create 90,000 new jobs in the sector. Beyond mining, though, much of Vision 2030's aspirations are centered around tourism, specifically revolving around the Hajj and Mecca. For those of you who don't know, each of the world's 1.5 billion Muslims are supposed to visit Mecca during their lifetime, which sits on Saudi Arabia's west coast. And, in part because of this, Mohammed bin Salman wants to quadruple the number of annual visitors compared to 2015. And while numbers took a dip during the pandemic, they'd already doubled by 2018. Bin Salman hopes that by diversifying the economy, he can reduce the Saudis' reliance on public sector jobs, thereby reducing overall unemployment, which currently sits at about 12%. Now, all of these programs will also be accompanied and facilitated by massive, ambitious infrastructure projects, including NEOM, a layered zero-carbon city that includes a 100-mile-long mirror skyscraper. But now we've got to face the big question: will it actually work? Well, there are reasons to be a pessimist. International experiences show that diversifying away from oil, or for that matter, any dominating export commodity, is difficult. Perhaps the most successful example is Norway, which through good governance and sound management of its sovereign wealth fund has become one of the wealthiest and most developed countries in the world. However, even Norway has struggled to fully break its fossil fuel dependence, and crude oil and natural gas still amount for about 50% of all of Norway's exports by value. It's also worth saying that Saudi Arabia is competing with other petro-states to attract private capital at the moment. Basically, all of the Gulf countries are trying to do the same thing. They're also diversifying. And some, including the UAE, have a significant head start on the Saudis. Therefore, if Vision 2030 is to succeed, then the Saudis will have to offer something that Dubai can't. And in some part, this will all depend on the scope of the social and economic reforms that MBS is able to push through without upsetting various stakeholders involved, including the incumbent oil interests and the Muslim religious elite, who still wields significant power in Saudi society. Nonetheless, though, it's not all bad news for Vision 2030. Saudi Arabia's recent international bond issuing, which started in 2016, has been reliably oversubscribed, which suggests that the Saudis won't struggle to attract foreign capital. Saudi Arabia also has significant fiscal headroom to fund this project. Debt to GDP currently stands at just 30%, well below the global average, and the recent boon in global oil prices will only strengthen the kingdom's finances. It's also worth mentioning that the government has begun reforming the country's public investment fund, previously used as sort of a domestic development bank, turning it into something more akin to Norway's sovereign wealth fund, intended to provide a substantial and predictable source of government wealth. All in all then, while Vision 2030 might be an ambitious plan, and while they might have some serious competitors in the region, it does seem that the Saudis are off to a good start with this strategy, and at least they're trying to diversify. As a final thing, a lot of the data for this video came from David Rundell's 2020 book. He's the chief of mission at the American Embassy in Ryder, and we actually recently spoke to him about the status of Saudi Arabia and Vision 2030 more specifically. So if you want to watch that full interview and find out more from the experts, then that's exclusively on Nebula. You've likely heard us talk about Nebula before, but give me 1 minute to explain why you should care. And as always with TLDR, there's 3 points. Firstly, signing up to Nebula gets you a ton of additional TLDR content. We have a whole bunch of videos exclusively for Nebula, including all of these full-length TLDR videos, as well as exclusive interviews and a bunch of fun videos, like our studio tour and our team attempting the British citizenship test. And that number doesn't even include the daily briefing. So there's a ton of extra TLDR every single day. Secondly, everything on Nebula is ad-free. And that's not just TLDR either. That's all of your favorite creators, like Wendover Productions, Real Life Law, Polymatter, Legal Eagle, Half as Interesting, and many others. And all of this content is ad-free, so there's no mid-rolls, and I wouldn't be here talking to you right now. Thirdly, signing up and watching on Nebula really helps the channel. Here's the maths. TLDR viewers signing up to Nebula has significantly improved our ability to monetize our content, which in turn has allowed us to begin employing more people and investing more in new technology to improve our content. Now, you might not have noticed it immediately, but you will very soon, and signing up is super helpful. So you're convinced, right? Did I do it in a minute? Who knows, this is pre-recorded. Anyway, if you do want to sign up to Nebula, I've got good news, because we've done a deal with CuriosityStream, home to the best documentaries available online. So if you sign up to their streaming service using the link in the description, you'll get CuriosityStream for the crazy low price of $14.79 a year. And you'll also get access to Nebula. That's right, 2 streaming services for less than $1 a month. And by the way, CuriosityStream is awesome. It contains absolutely boatloads of high-quality documentaries on all kinds of topics that I know TLDR viewers are going to love. So if you want to get both for less than $15 a year, then the link is in the description. And if not, well, you can't say I haven't tried to convince you. Thanks for your support.